Welcome back, everyone, to Chapter 4. This is Part 2 as we continue our journey of histology, the study of tissue. Now that we have become more familiar with epithelium tissue, which is what we discussed in Part 2, we're going to go ahead and pay attention or focus on the three remaining types of tissues that we have in the human body: connective tissue, muscular tissue, and nervous tissue. Let's start with the most abundant tissue type that we have, which is connective tissue. Connective tissue has a wide variety of different examples. In fact, they're divided into four main classes, which we'll talk about: connective tissue proper, cartilage, bone, and blood. And you might recall in part 1 that I mentioned to you that blood is the only liquid or fluid tissue type that we have in our body. Now, when it comes to connective tissue, we're going to see that it is a completely different setup than epithelium tissue. One of the main differences is that the cells do not desire to have cell-to-cell contact. Instead, the cells will often be put into what we call an extracellular matrix or a suspension that will allow the connective tissue to have more of a binding and supportive role versus the epithelium tissue, which was more concerned about covering and protection in a sheet-like format. Let me go ahead and show you this courtesy from our book. This is table 4.1, where it shows you the differences between the different classification of connective tissue. You will also notice that the naming of the connective tissue has nothing to do with the overall shape or arrangement of layers like it had with the epithelium. This one's going to be a whole different category. So let me, for instance, show you. In our first category, we have what we call connective tissue proper. And in here, you have the loose and you have the dense. And some of the examples are going to be areolar, adipose, and reticular for loose, regular, irregular, and elastic for the dense connective tissue. And right now, those names might not mean anything. But what I'm trying to point out is the fact that it doesn't highlight the cell type or the arrangement of it. Instead, what we're going to see is that the components of the tissue, when we look at our illustrations, are going to highlight, yes, there are cells, but these cells do not make physical contact. Instead, they will have a matrix or a background that can be filled with a gel-like material, as well as certain fibers like collagen, reticular, or elastic, which will appear almost like pieces of thread that are dispensed within the slide. I also want to highlight that the name of the cells will vary depending on if we're looking at our connective, cartilage, bone, or blood examples. When you're referring to connective tissues, you're going to notice that the cells are referred to as fibroblasts and fibrocytes. When you're looking at cartilage, you're going to be referring to chondroblasts and chondrocytes. Now, notice how they'll both end with the blast and the site, and that's because the blast, whether it's fibroblast, chondroblast, or in a little bit we're going to see osteoblast for the bone, the blast indicate that you have a cell that is actively building. So think of the B as for in blast as for building. That was a tongue twister, wasn't it? So the B in blast is for building, and what it's building is the matrix, the background, that gel in which it's going to be surrounded or embedded. Eventually, the cell will get surrounded by the gel and it will get stuck. At that point, it no longer builds and it matures. So it's just there for maintenance and observation. So then we're no longer going to call it a fibroblast, we're going to call it a fibrocyte. Same thing with the chondroblast versus chondrocyte. The blast is building, and once it's done, it's called a chondrocyte. So fibroblasts and fibrocytes for the connective tissue proper, chondroblasts and chondrocyte for the cartilages. Migrate towards the end part of the table, we can see that for bone tissue, we're going to have our osteoblast and our osteocytes. For blood, we will have the mention of our erythrocytes, which are our red blood cells, our leukocytes, and of course our platelets. Leukocytes are the white blood cells, and then the platelets are going to be cell fragments that will help with things like blood coagulation. mentioned to you before, when you take a look at your connective tissue, you're going to notice that we don't really see the cells interacting with each other. And we also don't see that they're named for their shape and arrangement. However, they do share some characteristics altogether, regardless of which subclass you're looking for. Here you have 3 characteristics that will continuously appear. The first one is that all connective tissue is from the same embryonic origin. All of them arise from mesenchyme tissue. The second one is that there is a high amount of blood vessel variation within the connective tissue. For instance, your bones are highly vascular, whereas your cartilages are avascular. So there's varying degrees from the high to the low to the in-between. And then, of course, as I was mentioning to you before, one of the hallmark characteristics of connective tissue is that the cells will be suspended in an extracellular matrix. And the extracellular matrix is going to be a protein sugar mix. It's almost like a gel. I often like to tell my students to imagine that they're pouring resin all over, and as the resin hardens, that will then be an example of the extracellular matrix. Embedded in the resin will then be the different cells and the fibers of the connective tissue that we're looking at. And this matrix, besides supporting the cells, will also allow for a lot of weight-bearing capacity, which is excellent for being resistant to any type of tension or stress that might be placed on that particular body part. Tissue will also see that it will have cells, fibers, and ground substances that will have to interplay with each other. And of course, the ground substance, that's the extracellular matrix that I've been mentioning all along. And the composition of these 3 entities, the ground substance, the fibers, and the cells, that composition, and I should say the variation of it, will then allow us to determine what type of connective tissue we are looking at. Now, I love this next slide because it gives an illustrated example of what a model connective tissue can look like. And as you can see, the cells are no longer interested in just kind of making physical contact and forming a sheet like we had in epithelium tissue. Now we see that the cells are varying, whether it's a blast or a site. We also see that the cells have these long strings or fibers that they can interact with. And that's, of course, what we find in our extracellular matrix: collagen fiber, elastic fibers, reticular fibers. We'll talk a little bit more about those in the next slide. And then all this blue in the background, that is our ground substance. So that is our protein carb mix, our gel that we're looking for, that is suspending the cells and allowing for the strength and the tension that the connective tissue can withstand. Now, I said to you we're going to discuss the fibers. Let's quickly talk about them, and that way we can take a look at some histology or some slides of the different connective tissue categorizations. So, 3 options for the fibers, and remember, these fibers are going to appear like little pieces of thread embedded within the slide. The most abundant one is collagen, and this one is also the strongest. The more collagen a connective tissue has, the tougher and the higher it's able to resist any tension or stress being placed on it. If you would like a little bit of stretch, then elastic fibers are the ones you want to look for. Elastic fibers are going to allow for a stretch and recoil mechanism to occur. And last but not least will be our reticular fibers. Now, the reticular fibers are often very short. However, they'll be highly branched, and this allows it to have more of a framework function or characteristics. Reticular fibers love to form almost like a little scaffolding, which will allow for the shape and a networking system to be set up. I will definitely be showing you some examples of how you can have individual fibers, as well as a collection of both of them intermingling within the particular connective tissue example. All right, enough talk. Let's take a look at some illustrations. So, there are 4 main classes of connective tissue. We have our connective tissue proper. Then we're going to take a look at cartilage, bone, and blood. So let's start off with connective tissue proper, which within it has a subclass. These are going to be known as loose connective tissue and dense connective tissue. Please know examples within each of the two subclasses. So as you can see on your slide, the loose connective is going to be the areolar, adipose, and reticular tissue. And then the dense connective is going to focus on dense regular, dense irregular, and elastic. Okay, here's an example of areolar tissue. Now, when you look at areolar tissue on the illustration, I think the first thing you'll notice is that the cells, which as you can see here in purple, these little purple dots, I don't know why it makes me think of blueberries looking at this. These little purple dots are the nuclei. As you can see, they are not physically connected to each other. Instead, it almost looks like they're suspended in the background. And the background or the ground substance, that's their extracellular matrix. So that's the gel-like substance that it's embedded in. And you also see all these little lines, just kind of threads floating all around. That is going to be the combination of your elastic fibers and your collagen fibers. And believe it or not, there's also some reticular fibers embedded within. This is what your areolar tissue looks like. Now you can see on the side, you can take a look at some of the function. It tends to wrap and cushion organs. It plays an important role in inflammation, and it can hold and convey tissue fluid. For its location, we're going to concentrate on the fact that it packages organs and it tends to surround capillaries. I also want to point out the insert picture right here, where we can see that our connective tissue is found below our epithelium tissue in the lamina propria. Another one that I want to show you, and this is also loose connective, is going to be adipose tissue. Adipose tissue is what many of us just commonly call fat tissue. It is filled with epidocytes, and these epidocytes, they actually look like little droplets or large circles. And believe it or not, the outline that I'm making on red, that's the actual cell. It has a droplet in the center of it that as it fills with fat, it becomes larger and larger. Now, adipose tissue serves for a reserve of food fuel. We all know that, right? Whenever we have a little bit too much to eat or we're consuming too many calories, our body will conserve that excess in our epidocytes, in our adipose tissue. But it also plays a role in insulation and, of course, supporting and protecting different organs. For the location, I went ahead and I highlighted that you can find them under the skin as well as in the breast, where the adipose tissue will often play a role in the overall shape of the formation of the breast. The third example of loose connective tissue is going to be reticular tissue. Now, when you look at reticular tissue, you're going to notice that you have lots of reticular fibers that are floating around. Notice how they're very branched, which is one of the characteristics of reticular fibers. We can also see that the cells are embedded within. And once again, the cells are not making direct contact. They're simply embedded within the extracellular matrix. Now, because of the massive amount of reticular fibers and the name reticular tissue, when we look at the function, we're going to notice that it is forming a soft internal skeleton, can be used for support, and one of the main locations where we can find it will be our lymphoid organs. So these are going to be things like our lymph nodes, our bone marrow, and the reason that they love to use reticular tissue is because the various white blood cells can easily attach themselves or lean against the scaffolding of the reticular fibers, waiting until there's a need for them to be, dropped into the bloodstream to go over to a site of injury. All right, so that was the loose connective tissue. Staying within our connective tissue proper, let's now take a look at the dense connective tissue. Now, the dense connective tissue, we're going to see that there's going to be a lot more fibers, allowing for a more structured view to appear. The first example would be dense regular. Dense regular gets its name because it has a massive amount of collagen fibers that are lined up in a very parallel, uniform format. Under the microscope, it always reminds me of just like these waves that are intertwining and neatly organized on top of each other. The darkened spots that you see, those are the nuclei of the fibroblast. For the function, I've highlighted that you can find them as attachments for muscle to bones or other muscles or bones to bones. So that would mean that the location would then focus on things like tendons and ligaments. Look at that. Now, if there is a dense regular, it would make sense that there is a dense irregular, and that will be our next connective tissue. Dense irregular also has a high amount of collagen fibers, but now they are irregularly or abstractly put within the tissue type. So as you can see here, the collagen fibers are stained blue, and you can see gone are the very wave-like parallel format, and instead it almost looks like it's scrunched up and just thrown within the extracellular matrix. Now, believe it or not, this irregular shape is actually very beneficial because it allows us to withstand a lot of tension and stress being placed on that particular body part or location. So as you can see from our highlights, I went ahead and I indicated that the fibrous capsules of joints and organs, as well as the dermis of the skin, which is the second layer of the skin underneath the epidermis, is full of dense, irregular tissue. Here is our elastic tissue. So this is our last example for the dense connective. Here, instead of collagen fiber, we just have a lot of elastic fibers. Elastic fibers, as you may have seen before, they tend to stain very dark under the slide. So you can see them here in black lines stacked on top of each other. They will have an elasticity property to it, so they're excellent for recoiling. So it makes sense that we would find them within the walls of the large arteries. So here you have the aorta pictured. Now, as the arteries expand, allowing for the blood to flow through it, we also see that they will eventually have to recoil as the blood empties out of it. Now, the elastic fibers are going to allow for the tissue to expand and recoil while maintaining proper flow and pressure changes to it. So it's an excellent solution to allow for a high pressure point, low pressure point, and continuous flow by allowing the arteries to stretch that they need to properly function. So that is the end of our connective tissue proper. So what we're going to do now is take a look at our cartilages. Now, as a reminder, when you do cartilages, when you take a look at the cells, we are now going to refer to them as chondroblasts and chondrocytes. Previously, with our connective tissue proper, we were taking a look at fibroblasts and fibrocytes. So with the cartilages, chondroblast and chondrocyte. Now, cartilages are avascular, as I previously mentioned, and the categories or the types are going to be hyaline cartilage, elastic cartilage, and fibrocartilage. All right, let's start with our hyaline cartilage. Now, hyaline cartilage will have a massive amount of chondroblasts that are going to be secreting the matrix. You're going to notice that in this case, the matrix appears as a more solid color. And you're also going to notice that the cell nuclei, still a little bit darkly stained, will have this white space that surrounds them. This white space is called a lacuna or lacunae, and it's basically a cavity. As the chondroblast, I'm so sorry, my apologies. As the chondroblast builds the extracellular matrix, eventually it becomes trapped in its little lacunae, this little dip, and at that point it no longer builds and it's then transformed into a chondrocyte, a mature cell. Hyaline tissue or hyaline cartilage is best known for support and reinforcement. We have a wide variety of items to choose from when we take a look at the location. Here on our illustration, we can see the costal cartilages that we have in our rib cage. You can also find it, for instance, in the trachea, the larynx. You can take a look at it within the long bones, embryonic skeleton. In the beginning, before we have our bones, the hyaline cartilage is our first initial format of formation. When you take your nose and you wiggle it, the part that wiggles, that is full of hyaline cartilage. So you can find it in quite a few places within the body. Next option is elastic cartilage. Now, elastic cartilage is going to have lots and lots of elastic fibers, hence the name, right? So you can see the darkened fibers that appear. You will also see that you still have the lacunae, the little dip that will house the cell inside of it, the chondrocyte. Because of the elastic fibers, there will be a little bit of flexibility. So it would make sense that our options for the location are going to be the earlobe or the pinna and the epiglottis. Now, for those of you who haven't heard of the epiglottis before, it is a fold of tissue that basically allows us to separate air and food from the esophagus versus the trachea. And as you're chewing and chewing and chewing, and when it's time to swallow, what's going to happen is that the epiglottis will close off the opening of the trachea so that the food will go behind it into the esophagus and, of course, into your stomach. Here is our last cartilage, which is fibrocartilage. Fibrocartilage is known for having very thick collagen fibers. And these collagen fibers, remember, these are going to allow for a lot of tension and absorption of shock. So for the location, you can see that we can find it in the intervertebral disc, which sit in between our vertebrae. We can also find it in the pubic symphysis, which sit in between our hip bones, and then within the discs of the knee joint. So all areas of the body that are usually exposed to a lot of tension and stress. And once again, if you look closely, you can see the lacunae, the little dip that will house the chondrocytes, highlighted by their nucleus in the slightly purple color. Our third type of connective tissue is going to be bone. Now, bone will have a distinctive, at least I think, a very distinctive appearance. It always reminds me of like tree trunks that are clustered together, and each tree trunk is going to be called an osteon. And within the osteon, you will find the cells that build bone, and these are then going to be referred to as osteoblasts. Remember, the B is for building. And once they get stuck in their lacunae, they will be referred to as osteocytes. All right, let me show you what this looks like. This is what bone, compact bone, looks like under the microscope. And see the little tree trunks that I was mentioning? So here's one, here's another. And each complete tree trunk is called an osteon. That is the functioning unit of a bone. And within it, you can see that it has a central part that has been darkly stained. This is called the central canal. Some books will refer to it as the Haversian canal. That is where all the blood vessels and nerve fibers are located. The bone is highly vascular, so that's why we need lots of access to blood vessels. And then surrounding the central canal, you're going to have these little halo rings that form. These are called lamellas. So the lamellas are basically the indicator of the ground substance and the extracellular matrix that are being built. So the little rings around the center of the central canal. Within the lamellas, you might notice that you have little black stripes. These are the lacunae. So those are the little dips. And inside of the lacunae, you will house your osteocytes, your mature bone cells. It should give no one a cause for surprise to see that for the location, your bones. That's where we're going to find our compact bone. And within the function, you can see things like supporting and protection, leverage and attachment for the muscle, calcium storage is a really good one. And in the yellow bone marrow storage of bone, we also have an excellent site for red bone marrow for hemopoiesis or blood cell formation. All right, and last but not least, final connective tissue is going to be blood. And remember, this one is special because it's the only fluid tissue that we have within our body. And in this case, we're going to have our red blood cells or erythrocytes, our white blood cells or leukocytes, and our platelet cells suspended within the plasma, which is our extracellular matrix that just happens to be liquid compared to the other connective tissues that had more of a solid or a gel appearance. So here is our slide of blood, and all the little red structures that you see, those are your red blood cells. The white blood cells are larger, and as you can see, they have their nucleus still intact. And then you have small little fragments within. Those are your platelets. In future chapters, we will talk a lot more about the function and appearance of the red blood cell, the different versions of white blood cells, and of course the platelets. But for now, let's just focus on the fact that blood is an example of connective tissue. All right. So we have conquered epithelium tissue. We have discussed connective tissue. Let's go ahead and take a look at muscle tissue. Muscle tissue, we have 3 types to discuss: skeletal, cardiac, and smooth muscle. All of them are going to be highly vascularized, lots and lots of blood vessels. They, of course, will contract and relax, which will allow for movement to be utilized. And there are some differences, as you can see on the PowerPoint. I highlighted that some of them are, well, not some of them, just one. Skeletal muscle is what we call voluntary, while the other 2 are involuntary. What that hints at is that voluntary muscle you can consciously control. So for instance, if I say to you, hey, take your hand and go ahead and stretch your fingers or make a fist, we can allow that movement to occur because we can consciously control when those muscles contract and relax, right? If I say to you, hey, kick your leg up or do a squat, we can do that, or smile, because those muscles can be consciously controlled. Cardiac muscle and smooth muscle are under involuntary control because your nervous system will fully control when you are utilizing them. So you don't have to think about contracting and relaxing your cardiac muscle. Your heart on average beats every 0.8 seconds. It would be crazy if we would have to remind ourselves to keep the heart beating, right? So the brain will take care of that. So that's the difference between voluntary and involuntary control. Skeletal muscle and cardiac muscle are also what we call striated muscle. And striated muscle means that when we look at them under the microscope, we're going to see that they have a band-like format. These bands are the muscle cells. And within the muscle cells, we're going to see these parallel lines that form. Notice how some of them are a little bit thicker. And then so it goes thick and thin, thick and thin, thick and thin, or light and dark, light and dark, light and dark. These are what we call the actin and the myosin, or the thin and the thick filaments. These are the filaments that have to interact with each other in order for you to have a muscle contraction. And don't worry, there's a chapter coming up that will talk about all the details of making what we call cross bridges and the neuromuscular junction, and we'll go more into all that. But for now, whenever you see these parallel lines roaming along the muscle cell, please know that they are called striations. And you'll have these striations and they'll appear in skeletal muscle and they will appear in cardiac muscle. Now, let's see what it says in the description. So it says for the skeletal muscle, long multinucleated cells, obvious striations is under voluntary movement, and skeletal muscle comes all about attachments to bones, occasionally to the skin, like with our facial expressions. And of course, it is once again voluntary movement. Here is cardiac muscle. Now, cardiac muscle is also going to have striations, as you can see them right here. And one of the ways that you can tell skeletal and cardiac muscle apart is that cardiac muscle will have what we call an intercalated disc. An intercalated disc is a specialized junction where the heart cells, the myocytes, will bind together, creating a darker border than the striations. These are called intercalated discs, and they are exclusively found within our cardiac muscle, which is exclusively found within your heart. Okay, so cardiac muscle is also striated. This one is uninucleated, and it has intercalated disc under involuntary control. All right, now smooth, the third type of muscle, it gets its name because it does not have striations. It will still have thin and thick filaments because obviously it contracts and it relaxes, but it doesn't have it in a parallel format. It has a very irregular pattern of organizing the actin and the myosin, so that is why we lose the striation feel. We will still see the appearance of the nuclei, and smooth muscle is also under involuntary control, just like our cardiac muscle. Its functions will be mostly for our hollow organs or our internal organs. So that will be things like allowing for involuntary movement, like peristaltic contraction or propelling substances. So if we take a look at the movement of our food through our GI tract, or the formation of urine and expelling it from the kidneys over to the ureter, to the urinary bladder, your smooth muscle will take care of that. Alrighty, so your muscle, yours are going to be your skeletal, voluntary, striated, your cardiac, involuntary, striated, and then your smooth muscle, which is involuntary, non-striated. This brings us to our last category of our tissues, and that's going to be nervous tissue. And nervous tissue is exclusively found within the nervous system. So we're taking a look at the brain, the spinal cord, and the nerves. And within nervous tissue, you're going to see two types of cells. You will see the neurons, which are the ones that are specialized nerve cells. They're able to receive stimuli and process it and send off signals, release neurotransmitters. And then you're going to have the support cells. The support cells are called the glial cells or neuroglial cells. They greatly outnumber the neurons. I think the last time I checked, most research papers say 1,000 to 1. So for every one neuron, you have 1,000 glial cells that have supportive roles, such as, for instance, producing cerebral spinal fluid, allowing myelination to occur, supporting the overall growth and development and signaling of the neurons. This tissue looks like under the microscope. The larger cells that you see, those are the neurons. And within the neurons, and I kind of like this illustration right here, within the neurons, you will have the cell body or the soma, which houses the nucleus. And it will have lots of dendrites, which is where the signaling comes in. And then it has an axon. And the axon is what's used, in essence, to transmit the effect or the neurotransmitter that the neuron has decided needs to be the course of action. And surrounding the neurons, you might see very small little dots all over the place. And those are the glial cells or neuroglial cells. So once again, nervous tissue, which is found in the brain, spinal cord, and nerves. Please know that it is composed of neurons and glial cells. Alrighty, so having said that, let's go ahead and let's finish up our chapter by mentioning a few things. One of them should be the different linings or covering membranes that we have. When you take a look at these membranes, so things like mucous membranes, cutaneous membranes, or serous membranes, it'll be based primarily of epithelium and connective tissue working together. Now, the difference between the membranes all has to do as to what it is lining or covering. So it's better for me to show you than to tell you. Here we go. Here is a look at cutaneous membranes, serous membranes, and mucous membranes. Now, cutaneous membranes means that they tend to cover the skin or body surfaces. So they tend to cover the outside. Mucous membranes means that at one point or another, they have mucus producing cells, and that you will have a lining within a body cavity that has an orifice or an opening. So for instance, here in the illustration, you can see the navel cavity, you can see the mouth, These are all openings that lead to either the respiratory system or the digestive system. These systems are lined by mucous membranes. Remember our little goblet cells we were talking about? And because it has an opening or an orifice, we call that a mucous membrane. So you would also find that, for instance, with your urinary system, you would find that with the reproductive system. These membranes, once again, have an internal cavity and they have an opening, an orifice. If you only have an internal cavity that does not open, it's completely close to the exterior, well, then we classify that as a serous membrane. And the serous membrane, as you can see here, is going to be things like lining the lungs, lining the heart, where they allow for pleurus or double layers to form. It's almost like you're saran wrapping the organs. And what's really nice about that is that it makes it harder for an infection the jump from one organ to the next, and it also reduces friction. So as you can see, the heart is embedded within the lungs, and as the lungs are expanding, as you're inhaling and exhaling, and the heart is beating, they tend to rub on each other, but it turns out that the lining will reduce the friction so that it's not painful for both of these organs to be engaged at the same time. This then leads us to our final few things to mention, which is tissue repair. So if there is damage done to the barrier of the body, how do we go about fixing this? And as you can imagine, this needs to be done rather quickly. So we have 3 steps that are in allowing for tissue repair to occur. That's going to be the inflammation, the restoration of the blood supply, and then the regeneration or fibrosis effect. Now, what's the difference? Regeneration means that you are able to replace the damaged cell with the same exact cells and original function is restored. So you repair and you restore. Fibrosis means that you go ahead and just clog up the damage, you plug it up, the original function is lost, and a lot of people will say, oh, like scar tissue? And that's a perfect example of it. Fibrosis effect usually means that you have connective tissue that has been damaged, and what's going to happen is that, my apologies, that you have damage to the cells, that it's going to allow for the connective tissue to kind of fill up that spot. And once again, you will lose the function in it, but it's an excellent way to kind of clog up the damage so that the cells that can regenerate can be restored and the function can be returned in that particular section. Here is a look at the 3 steps. So you have your inflammation, you have your organization, and you have your regeneration. Let's go ahead and take a look at them individually. So here you can see that you have a piece of skin and there is a little wound that's hurted. So you have the little scab that starts. You can see that there's blood in the injured site that's happening. And in the first step, what we're going to see is massive amount of inflammation. And what the inflammation is going to allow to happen is for chemicals to be released that will allow white blood cells to start migrating over to the site of injury. You will also have a massive amount of red blood cells that will start to infuse that area. And that is why often when something is damaged, you notice that it looks red blood cells. It is warm because you have a higher amount of cells in that area. And oftentimes it will also have a warming component to it. And that all has to do with the immersion of the metabolic functions of your red blood cells, white blood cells, and platelets that appear in that area. You also want to make sure that there's a clotting factor, and that is because we want to make sure that the blood doesn't escape and that we restore the blood flow and cover it. So that's one of the reasons why the scab will quickly form and also why we shouldn't tear it off, even though sometimes that scab feels so good to peel it off, right? Please don't do that because that means that we're going to have to start the repair all over again. Once inflammation has successfully brought over all the different cells and chemicals that are needed, the second step is going to be to restore the blood supply. And part of that is because we don't want the clot to sit there for too long. We want to replace the blood vessels. So very early on, we see that things like fibroblasts will come over and start producing collagen fibers. We'll have white blood cells like macrophages that will start cleaning up any type of debris or dead cells. And the epithelium cells, because they have such a high regenerative power, they will quickly start to restore the damaged cell. And they're regenerating, which means that they are replacing the damaged cell and they are restoring the function that it originally had. The area that's damaged underneath it in the connective tissue layer, most of that will be clogged up with glandular tissue. So here is our last step, which is regeneration and fibrosis. And you can see that the epithelium has been fully restored where there is a fibrotic area, a scar tissue area within the connective tissue. Now, I will say that oftentimes this fibrosis area will slowly break itself down. However, if there is a massive amount of injury, that scar may be for the remainder of the life of the particular tissue or the organism that we are looking at. Our final slide for this gives us a nice little list of the different regenerative capacity of the tissues that we've discussed thus far. And as you can see, it introduces or it gives you examples of tissue that regenerate very quickly, such as epithelium tissue, bone, areolar, dense irregular, blood-forming tissue. You also have tissues with moderate regenerative capacity. That's going to be things like your smooth muscle and your dense regular. And tissues with virtually no functioning regenerative, those are going to be things like your cardiac muscle, as well as the nervous tissue of the brain and the spinal cord. Alrighty, that is the end of another chapter. Please do not hesitate to contact me if you have any questions, comments, and concerns. And we shall talk soon or meet again for a next chapter. Bye, everyone.